On today's World Insight, full steam ahead with cooperation between China and the United Nations, especially on sustainable development goals. What's next for this long history of collaboration? A one-on-one with UN Deputy Secretary-General Amina Mohammed.
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight. As a founding member, China has been a staunch supporter of the United Nations. That was the message to the UN Deputy Secretary-General Amina Mohammed, who met with Wang Yi, the Director of Foreign Affairs Commission of the CPC Central Committee, in a recent visit to China. Ms. Mohammed lauded China's contributions to the UN, and she sought to step up cooperation with China on top goals, sustainable development goals, climate action, environmental protection, digital innovation, and the list goes on. Wang Yi said China is ready to work on achieving the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development on time. So what stood out to Ms. Mohammed the most during her visit to China? What more can do to achieve better result between the cooperation, United Nations, and China? For all those answers, let's hear this interview. Madam Deputy Secretary-General, what a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here.
You, years ago, led the process of a global discussion that eventually resulted in the agreement to work on sustainable development and the 17 goals. Now, we are already at the midpoint. So where are we now in terms of achieving these 17 goals?
Well, it was an amazing framework of 17 goals. It was one that took 4 years for us to come up with this agenda. Where are we today? Unfortunately, not in a good place. The statistics that we have show that around the world that we've only managed to attain 12% of the goals. And there are many reasons for this, but primarily it is a time when we will say we are off track. We're off track on poverty, we're off track on access to health, to education. And from the time that we had COVID, from the time that we've seen extreme climate events, also the war in Ukraine, this has exacerbated our ability to catch up with the goals and to implement them in countries. So while we see progress in some, we overall, halfway through, are off track.
What are some of the points that you personally are looking at very closely, almost on a daily basis?
I think the equality goal is important, the gender goal is important, because the framing of the SDGs was always around a core that we leave no one behind, that there is no discrimination, there are no vulnerable groups that get forgotten, and that women, who are half of our populations, and youth, in many cases, many developing countries, over 70%, are included in the benefits and the impacts of investing in the SDGs. So I look at them really closely because with those, every other part of the agenda matters, whether it is poverty, health, industrialization, the climate agenda, financing. These all come together in one aspiration, one promise to the people by 2030.
There is a problem. Rhetoric's always louder than actions.
Yes.
And sometimes rhetoric's louder than realities. And that is a big problem we are facing today. Yeah. Madam Deputy Secretary-General, I know you have been working very hard on that. What is the current solution that you see together with your colleagues?
2030 Agenda has always been a multilateral endeavor. It's about the world coming together. I always say that the UN is our global town hall for the global village. And what we need is more solidarity, unity of purpose. And this purpose for the framing of the SDGs makes it possible. So we need to talk more, we need to invest, we need to understand that one pain in one part of the world is exactly the same way someone's feeling that pain in another side of the world. And that to be excluded from a life that gives you dignity, that gives you hope, is not acceptable today. So I think that the things that we need to do, our governments need to come together to live up to the promises of their people, their rights, their expectations. Business needs to participate because they do drive for the jobs, they drive the economies. We need to see civil society better engaged in finding solutions, young people. So everyone's got a part to play, and each country is different. This is what's exciting about the SDGs, is that you place it in its context. Now, some countries are doing quite well when you say an enabling environment. Others are not. There are humanitarian crises, there's a climate crisis for the islands. There are very many different tensions. Where you don't invest in development, you have conflict. So you will see that in Africa, in many places in Southeast Asia, you have got discontent and you've got conflicts. And these are the things that we need to find a way to use the SDGs to deal with the root causes of much of what we have not been able to achieve for people and, of course, the planet.
Where is China on all of this?
Up front and center. I have to tell you that when we were designing the goals, China was actually slightly ahead. They had developed their 10-year plan, and at the center of it were the SDGs. So they had an early start. And I think here you've been able, with the scale of things, to get quite far down the road on many of the goals. So the poverty goal, for sure, and education, access to education. And so doing well, and doing well at scale. This is what China demonstrates to countries who feel that they have not been able to get across to everyone. This is a country that knows how to invest in the scale of things. When you say everyone, then, you know, have you got a city that is inclusive? Is it everyone who's getting an education? Children that are children of the nomads, how are they being brought into education? And I think this has been a demonstration.
According to the Sustainable Development, the 17 goals, China is very excited to working on this agenda. The many people you've been talking to, I'm sure they have been giving you the feedback. Meanwhile, the Chinese government has also providing the Chinese version of how to do it. For example, sustainable for the Global Development Initiative, a Global Security Initiative, a Global Civilization Initiative, and the list that goes on. How do you see these genuine efforts coming from China, the largest developing country?
I think these are very important. We see the framing of many initiatives, and the initiatives in China are framed around the SDGs. So it makes it much easier to communicate in countries that China partners with in the developing world to try to see how you invest in infrastructure, how you're going to invest in business. And it doesn't really matter which initiative, as long as the attainment of the SDGs are there. Now, we've seen some very good examples of China's investment in the data centers.
Yes.
A lot of what we don't have is baseline data. If you don't know where you're coming from, how do you know where you're going? So the SDG Spatial Data Center, which I saw here, is one of 4 around the world, but is the one that is connecting the world. It's not just for China. And what we saw there was its ability to connect across different countries where the UN is, so that we help other countries to frame with spatial data the evidence that they need, the science, the baselines on ecosystems, for instance, or cities. So, you know, many initiatives that are coming out of China, and they are shared. And I think that this is what is important, is the ability to share knowledge, experiences. It encourages other countries to know it can happen, it can be done.
Well, Madam Deputy Secretary-General, I'm very impressed by all of the work that you and your colleagues are doing here in China in terms of cooperation, including many of the things you are talking about. The other thing, Madam Deputy Secretary-General, is the multipolar world we're facing today. So what does that mean for financing for development, to deal with climate crisis and many other issues? Where are governments? Where are businesses? And do we see the synergy between them? I've been talking to business leaders around the world, and I see there's still something that needs to be done, but I would love to have your input.
Well, we're halfway through the SDGs, and we will come to New York to gather leaders and tell us where we are. We are missing Goal 17 badly, the means of implementation. So finance, what we do in trade, what we do in technology, and the capacity to deliver. It's unfortunate we made a promise, but we haven't paid for it. And part of that is to bring the finances to those countries that don't have, sometimes in more concessional terms. It's not just a grant. You are borrowing, but you're borrowing at a rate that everybody else is. And this hasn't happened. And so what the United Nations has done is that the Secretary-General has offered a framework for what we can do in the medium term to get financing for education, for health, for industrialization, for the climate agenda, by saying that, this is an SDG stimulus that can provide financing to address the debt, because debt that many countries have today, it's not because they were bad managers, but the impact of COVID, the impact of the war in Ukraine, interest rates went up. What you did not expect, now you have to deal with. You have to make choices between whether you're going to pay for health or education. It should not be a choice. So countries need to have debt relief. They need to be restructured. And that's one part of it. The second part is existing institutions like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, multilateral development banks, should be able to use more their balance sheets, bring more money into the banks. You need to restructure in terms of making it better and more efficient, using innovative instruments like the special drawing rights that we can get rechanneled, that can leverage the private sector, it can leverage more public sector money. So you can bring more resources in the immediate term, and this is possible. The Paris meeting, demonstrated what the possibilities were. We just didn't get the political will to move it. And then more importantly, we have to know that the UN that was designed to respond to the world and its needs and to prevent another war in 1945, the financial systems that were set in 75 years ago are no longer fit for purpose. And so we're offering again, how can we restructure the financial architecture? And that will mean looking at the way one participates in their quotas and so forth.
Yeah. So what you are saying is very clearly seems to be coincides with what Secretary General has always been saying. The international governance is so much lacking behind the reality.
Yes. Yeah. It's not fit for purpose. It is not accessible. It's morally unjust. It just does not do what it's supposed to do, and that is to provide resources for the very basics of a person's right to development, a person's right to education and health. And when countries are prevented from doing this because the design of a financial system prevents them, it gives different standards for different parts of the world. This is morally bankrupt. It cannot continue.
If these are important points, so how is the UN working with different stakeholders? In other words, trying to bring this into the momentum, because there is always an issue of speed, isn't it?
Everything is incredibly urgent. You cannot tell someone who doesn't see a meal tomorrow that you're going to come back to their issue in 2-3 weeks' time or a couple of months. They need to know tomorrow.
Yes.
So what we are doing is working with governments. We are a member state organization. We try to encourage governments around policies that and initiatives that we put on the table, and that's where we say the SDG stimulus to the G20, so that when those countries take decisions, they do with a sense of urgency on the debt framework, on rechanneling SDRs. Doesn't take more than a day or two to decide. And we know.
And yet they take years already.
Well, I have to say that it's very frustrating for us when we see countries can approve 400 billion to bail out a bank, but they can't find 100 billion for several countries to leverage another 400-500 billion in order to have people's lives and our environment protected.
You've been making a very efficient trip, packing so many things into a few days because you want to have a great understanding about what's going on and meeting your counterparts. Tell me about your takeaways so far.
Well, this trip was always set to appreciate the role and the partnership of China with the United Nations over the decades, with a focus on climate, the SDGs, and financing. But it was always my belief that, look, China is beyond Beijing.
Yes.
There's a country out there with millions of people, and the things that you've been saying that you've been doing. So why don't we actually engage with that so people get a sense of what this means? So meeting with the business community in Shanghai, amazing. Young women who are around the table talking about technology and the digital era that we're facing. Of course, many challenges. We have produced a digital compact that looks to protect people in that space, people's rights, children, all of those things were discussed there. Business was there for the SDGs as well. The UN Global Compact convenes a huge community of business leaders and what they're doing for the principles of getting to net zero, how businesses can green themselves. And I saw that in practice as I moved to Ordos, to the Kubuchi Desert Initiative,
Yes.
which is amazing, because it was about restoration. Restoration of the desert with a seed bank of over 1,040 plant species. Of course, it's taken decades and commitment, but what you saw there was going beyond afforestation and claiming back the desert. You saw that solar power panels were put out there on renewables. You have the largest investment in solar in the world, and we saw that happening in real time. Looking at solar panels and saying, lift them off the ground, underneath we can create greenhouses, so there's livestock, there's food security. This is important for the communities. Seeing that many nomadic children, I come from a nomadic family, so to see children from nomads go into schools that you and I would go to. So, you know, the hope for a child that could come from the desert but be able to reach their potentials. Yes. That's what we saw in practice.
And it's also very heartwarming, I guess.
Oh, it is. I mean, you know, hundreds of children. What else did we see? Scale. I mean, China is, you know, it's about the scale of issues. You have a population, so when you say you want to reach everyone, you're talking about millions of people. And so the industrial complexes that we saw that want to go to net zero, you have battery plants and of course how industrial complexes, which are huge, will actually be green. We saw solar panels, which are international companies coming to work here. And I think that this shows that in the remaining years to the SDGs, we're not there yet. There's still a lot to do, but the potential to do it, the glass is some full, and now we should talk about how to fill it. And I think that here, it's not just about China, it's about how we bring the world together to do it. South-South cooperation is going to be incredibly important. Signaling to the G20 that partnerships have to, at least in development, that we need not to instrumentalize them, to politicize them, because people's lives matter. The planet that is facing an existential threat with climate change matters, and those are things that we need to see as a priority.
How do you see, you know, your visit to China could help to advance the momentum as we are in the midpoint, reaching the Sustainable Development Goal, but also we are in the midpoint of really realizing all of the goals that we have ahead of us?
Very important for China's leadership to be present, to be at the SDG summit, to exchange all of these efforts that have been made for China, but also the partners. There are many partnerships. You mentioned the initiatives that China is taking for development, for infrastructure, even when we talk about energy, the transitions on energy. So it is important for us to demonstrate that and to show what commitments you're making when you get round the table on debt relief. How are you supporting countries to find a way not to forgive, but to restructure so that they can have some fiscal space, some resources to deal with funding their deficits right now for health, for education. So we do expect to see leaders from China in government, in business, in academia, in civil society, all participating. It's important that this is an agenda for everyone and that all voices are heard with what they have to offer. It's important to share the challenges. I mean, clearly, when I've seen some of the initiatives here, it's not all easy. You can produce renewables, but you have to say, how do you connect this to the grid?
Indeed.
It's not easy to see an exit from fossil fuels. Coal has been necessary to build many nations, but we have to exit coal. And how do we do that in a way that is just and that has, you know, a time we must have a timeline, because we are seeing a 1.5 degree world disappear if we don't put timelines and commit to them. So I hope to see that China is there in the collective and in a leadership role, pushing. The Paris Agreement would not have come to be if we didn't see 2-3 major powers come together to give us the ambitions for Paris. Right now, we need the ambition to deliver, to implement.
How to push for international cooperation, how to nurture, the efforts for all of this. I'm sure that's on your mind every day.
We convene. That's our job.
Yes.
We bring the most unexpected people around the table into a hall around an issue. My visit this time was not just about going to the field and speaking with business, it was also about speaking with different parts of government. As we spoke to the environment minister and to see, okay, how far are you going with your NDC? What does it mean for you? To speak with ministers that will deal with the critical minerals that are needed for the future. So it is about convening different countries around the table. I mean, you have had in the last week that I've been here many visitors. The Prime Minister of Barbados, a small island that has a big voice and has really made inroads into making demands for the least privilege, is in China, having discussions with the leadership. So it is about the United Nations and multilateralism, international cooperation, essential that we look for the common good. We will always disagree, and sometimes will be worse than others. But if we can find those common threads, because that's what we need for a more peaceful and prosperous world. The resources are there. They should be able to accommodate everyone, but often they don't. Often we leave a lot of people out. We are celebrating, a couple of years ago, 75 years of the UN. And we put on the table an offer. These are the areas that we need to rethink. A new deal for peace, a new financial architecture, a digital compact. This year will be 75 years on our Human Rights Charter. Where are we on that as a human family around the world? Can we make the inroads to make sure we don't leave anyone behind? So these are the things that we stand for. And I think that the young generation now will shape the new corporation, the new international family, building on the foundations that many of us have tried to build.
Madam Deputy Secretary-General, I know you have been putting tremendous efforts in nurturing the younger generation, as you said at the very beginning of our conversation, as well as women's role for gender equity around the world. How do you see that is woven into many of the priorities you just illustrated? How do we see the encouraging progress that's already happening? How can we be more mobilized?
Well, we certainly need to be in more positions of leadership. I often say to women, once you get into the space and occupy it, hold on to it, but bring more women in. And in the UN, when the Secretary-General first came, he said we have to have parity in management. Why? Because women do bring a different perspective to the table. We bring everyone in, and then there is focus, and we get on with it, both men and women. So it's important to see us not just in numbers, but in decision-making opportunities. Access to education that gets you through a career path that puts you in science, that puts you in technology. And I think these are places where we're still struggling. But I think the more we see women and the aspirations, you and I know that we take the family with us. We don't go alone. And I think that this is what is important, is to bring those perspectives. We need more visibility. We need more decision making. And I think that we also need more access to resources so that we too can become CEOs, we too can grow. And that, I think, is becoming more of a reality. But perhaps what we need to see now is many more presidents that are women leading countries. We've seen some, and where we saw them in the time of COVID, they're the ones who took the best decisions. We need to see women heading up the African Development Bank, the World Bank, the United Nations. That's what we want to see. That's the future. But we also want to see younger people. And I'm often saying that because I have 6 children of my own and 4 grandchildren. And I know they say, when are you going to retire? Well, there is a life cycle, and I will move aside, and young people will need to fill that. And we have to all remember we were young once. and there was a sense of urgency, and we want to get there now. And I think we have to encourage that. And this world, young people are much more connected. There is technology. They have many more skills that they can access at their fingertips. And I think that we should power them, we should enable them, we should partner with them, and they are sometimes got better answers than we have.
How do you see the role of advocacy, the role of great quality communication today?
I think that we have some of the best messages that come out of the multilateral system, the United Nations, the work that we do. We're just not very good messengers. And we have to know the value of that, because unless you engage and tell the story, people can't connect. They don't understand what it is that they can do to help. So I think the partnership and the relationship with the media needs to be stronger. It is different today. What people access on their phones, very few are doing what we did before. But media is different everywhere. In my country, it's the radio and how you interact on that. But in many other places, radio does not exist anymore. It's in the museum. It is social media. And all of these places are important, and how can we better connect? And I think it is to give you the story and for you to help us tell it. And that engagement, I think we all need a little bit more practice. I still say young people do it better. I remember when we first, as the UN, went on TikTok, it was terrible. I mean, we didn't know what to do, and we looked very old. But when young people said, no, this is what you need to do, on Twitter, on all these accounts that are social media, and I think perhaps some of the best that works for many more millions today is still television. People still go to the screen, and they want to connect with you, and how can we help better do that? So we're very grateful for people like you who bring the stories to life, because that's very difficult to do.
And we are grateful that people like you are making the stories happen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Madam Deputy Secretary-General, what a pleasure.
Thank you. It was an honor to be here.
Thank you so much. And that's my interview with Deputy Secretary-General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.